Some promises are made to be broken. On the morning of June 9, 1979, a young woman put on a white dress and drove to a Las Vegas wedding chapel. She was 24 years old. She was in love. She was hours away from becoming a bride. By sunset, she was dead. Her body was found in a motel room 3 blocks from the chapel, where she was supposed to say her vows. The wedding never happened. The groom disappeared. And for 44 years, no one knew who killed her or why. Then in 2023, a DNA breakthrough changed everything. This is the story of a bride who never made it to the altar, a city built on illusions, and the moment when science finally revealed what Las Vegas had kept hidden for decades. This is the story of broken promises, buried secrets, and justice that took nearly half a century to arrive. This is Las Vegas, 1979, and this is a cold case solved. Las Vegas, in the late 70s, was a city of contradictions, glamour and grit. Neon and darkness, dreams and desperation. It was a place where people came to reinvent themselves, to escape their pasts, to gamble on futures that might never arrive. The Strip glowed like a mirage in the desert, casinos rising from the sand with names that promised everything. The Stardust, the Sands, Caesar's Palace, the Flamingo. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the mechanical chime of slot machines. Outside, the heat was relentless, the kind of dry heat that made your skin feel tight and your throat raw. Beyond the Strip, Las Vegas was a different city. Motels with flickering vacancy signs, wedding chapels with plastic flowers and Elvis impersonators, pawn shops and liquor stores and parking lots full of dust and broken glass. It was a city where people came to get married in 5 minutes or divorced in a day, where fortunes were won and lost between sunset and sunrise. It was a city where anything could happen, and often did. Her name was Diane Mitchell. 24 years old, blonde hair that fell straight and shining past her shoulders, parted down the middle in the style of the time. Blue eyes, a smile that photographs captured but never quite explained. She was from Bakersfield, California, a small city 200 miles west, a place of oil fields and farmland and people who worked hard and dreamed small. Diane had bigger dreams. She had moved to Las Vegas 6 months earlier, in January 1979, looking for work and adventure. She found a job as a cocktail waitress at the Silver Slipper Casino, a mid-tier establishment on the northern end of the Strip. She rented a studio apartment in a complex off Tropicana Avenue. She made friends with other waitresses, other transplants, other young women who had come to Vegas looking for something they couldn't name. She was ordinary in the way that made her invisible in a city full of showgirls and high rollers. She wasn't trying to be a star. She was just trying to make rent and have a little fun. And then she met Michael. Michael Cordero was 28 years old, dark-haired, handsome in a way that seemed almost too polished. He told Diane he was a real estate investor, that he had properties in California and Nevada, that he was in Vegas on business. He wore expensive suits and drove a new Cadillac. He tipped well, he smiled easily. They met at the Silver Slipper in April. He came in 3 nights in a row, always sat at Diane's section, always ordered bourbon on the rocks. On the 3rd night he asked her to dinner. She said yes. Within a month they were inseparable. Within 2 months he proposed. Diane called her mother in Bakersfield, breathless with excitement. She was getting married. She was in love. She was moving to California with Michael, to a house he owned in San Diego. Her life was finally beginning. Her mother was cautious. She asked questions. How long have you known him? What does he do? Are you sure about this? Diane brushed off the concerns. She was 24, not a child. She knew what she was doing. Michael was good to her. He made her feel special. He made her feel seen. Her mother wanted to come to the wedding, but Diane said it would be small, just the 2 of them, and a witness at a chapel on the Strip. They would have a bigger celebration later, she promised. Right now, they just wanted to make it official. Her mother agreed reluctantly. She told Diane she loved her. She told her to be careful. Diane laughed. "Mom, I'm getting married, not going to war." Those were the last words they ever spoke. The wedding was scheduled for 2 p.m. On June 9, 1979, at the Chapel of Eternal Love, a small stucco building with fake Roman columns and a neon sign that blinked pink and white. It was one of dozens of wedding chapels in Las Vegas, the kind of place where you could get married for $50 and be back on the casino floor within an hour. Diane had bought her dress at a bridal shop in a strip mall, a simple white gown with puffy lace sleeves and a high neckline, the kind of dress that looked expensive in photographs, but wasn't. She had her hair done at a salon that morning, blown straight and shining. She did her own makeup, soft pink lipstick and blue eyeshadow. She looked beautiful. She looked happy. She checked out of her apartment that morning, packed her belongings into 2 suitcases, and drove to the Stardust Motel, a low-budget place 3 blocks from the chapel. Michael had booked a room there for the night. They would get married, spend the night in Vegas, then drive to San Diego the next morning to start their new life. Diane checked into room 107 at 11 a.m. She called her friend Karen, another waitress from the Silver Slipper, and told her she was getting married in 3 hours. Karen was surprised. She hadn't even known Diane was engaged. Diane laughed and said it had all happened so fast, but she was sure she was so sure. Karen asked if she needed anything. Diane said no, she was fine, she was perfect, she would call after the honeymoon. That was the last time anyone heard from Diane Mitchell alive. At 6:30 p.m., the manager of the Stardust Motel knocked on the door of room 107. A maid had reported that the door was slightly ajar, and there was no answer when she called out. The manager opened the door. Diane Mitchell was lying on the bed, still wearing her wedding dress. Her eyes were open, her skin was pale. There was no visible blood, no signs of struggle. She looked like she was sleeping, but she wasn't sleeping. She was dead. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrived within 20 minutes. They cordoned off the room, photographed the scene, collected evidence. The initial assessment was unclear. There were no obvious signs of trauma. No gunshot wounds, no stab wounds, no ligature marks. The room was neat, undisturbed. Diane's purse was on the dresser, her suitcases by the door, her wedding bouquet on the nightstand. It looked like she had simply lain down and died. But people don't just die on their wedding day. The medical examiner's preliminary report suggested asphyxiation, possibly strangulation, though there were no visible marks on her neck. Toxicology tests were ordered, but results would take weeks. The cause of death was listed as undetermined pending further investigation. Detectives began searching for Michael Cordero. They checked the Chapel of Eternal Love. No one had shown up for the 2 p.m. ceremony. The chapel had waited 30 minutes, then moved on to the next couple. They checked Diane's apartment. The landlord confirmed she had moved out that morning. They checked the Silver Slipper. Her co-workers confirmed she had quit 2 weeks earlier, saying she was moving to California with her fiancé. They tried to find Michael Cordero. They searched property records, business licenses, vehicle registrations. They found nothing. No real estate investor named Michael Cordero. No properties in California or Nevada. No Cadillac registered to that name. Michael Cordero didn't exist. And the man Diane Mitchell was supposed to marry had vanished into the desert air. Diane Marie Mitchell was born on November 12, 1954, in Bakersfield, California. She was the second of 3 children, raised in a modest house on the east side of town, where the air smelled like oil refineries and the summer heat was brutal. Her father worked at a drilling company. Her mother was a homemaker who took in sewing to make extra money. They were a working-class family, the kind that lived paycheck to paycheck, but always had food on the table and clothes on their backs. Diane was a quiet child, the kind who preferred reading to playing outside, who drew pictures in the margins of her schoolwork, who daydreamed about places she had never been. She was pretty, even as a child, with blonde hair and blue eyes that people always commented on, but she didn't think of herself as pretty. She thought of herself as ordinary, and in Bakersfield, ordinary meant invisible. She graduated from high school in 1972 with average grades and no clear plan. She took a job at a diner, waitressing 6 days a week, saving money with no particular goal in mind. She dated a few local boys, nothing serious. She lived at home with her parents, sleeping in the same bedroom she had grown up in, watching her friends get married and have babies and settle into lives that looked exactly like their mothers' lives. Diane wanted something different. She just didn't know what. In 1978, her older brother moved to Las Vegas. He got a job dealing blackjack at the Flamingo and called home every week with stories about the city, the lights, the energy, the sense that anything was possible. Diane listened, fascinated. In January 1979, she packed 2 suitcases, withdrew her savings from the bank, and drove to Las Vegas in a used Ford Pinto her father had helped her buy. She was 24 years old. She had $300 in her purse and no plan beyond finding a job and a place to live. Her mother cried when she left. Her father told her to be careful. Her brother promised to look out for her. Diane promised she would be fine. Las Vegas in 1979 was a city in transition. The old mob-run casinos were being replaced by corporate ownership. The Rat Pack era was fading. Disco was everywhere, pulsing from car radios and casino sound systems. The city was growing, sprawling into the desert, attracting people from all over the country who wanted to reinvent themselves. Diane found work quickly. The Silver Slipper Casino was always hiring cocktail waitresses, and Diane had experience. The pay was minimum wage plus tips, and the tips were good if you smiled and laughed at bad jokes and didn't complain when men touched your waist or called you sweetheart. She rented a studio apartment in a complex that catered to casino workers, a place with thin walls and a pool that was always empty. She made friends with other waitresses, women in their 20s and 30s who had come to Vegas for the same reasons she had, to escape small towns, bad relationships, boring futures. They went out together after shifts, to diners that served breakfast at 3 a.m., to bars where the drinks were cheap and the music was loud. They talked about their dreams, their plans, their somedays. Someday they would save enough money to go back to school. Someday they would meet someone who treated them right. Someday they would leave Vegas and start over somewhere else. But someday never seemed to arrive. Diane's life in Las Vegas was a routine of work and sleep and small pleasures. She worked 5 nights a week, Thursday through Monday, 4 p.m. to midnight. She wore a uniform, a short black dress, fishnet stockings, heels that made her feet ache. She carried a tray of drinks through the casino floor, weaving between slot machines and blackjack tables, smiling at strangers, collecting tips. The work was exhausting. The casino was loud, smoky, chaotic. Men hit on her constantly. Some were polite, some weren't. She learned to deflect, to laugh it off, to keep moving. But the money was decent. She made enough to pay rent, buy groceries, send a little home to her parents. She was independent. She was surviving. And she told herself that was enough. On a Tuesday night in April, Michael Cordero walked into the Silver Slipper. Diane noticed him immediately. He was different from the usual customers. He wore a tailored suit, not the polyester leisure suits most men wore. He had dark hair, neatly combed, and a confident smile. He sat at a table in her section and ordered bourbon on the rocks. He was polite. He tipped $20 on a $5 drink. He asked her name. When her shift ended, he was waiting by the employee exit. He asked if she wanted to get coffee. She hesitated. She had been hit on 1,000 times. But there was something about him that felt different. He didn't leer, he didn't touch her. He just smiled and waited. She said yes. They went to a diner on Fremont Street, a place with red vinyl booths and a jukebox that played Fleetwood Mac and the Bee Gees. They talked for 2 hours. Michael told her he was a real estate investor, that he bought and sold properties in California and Nevada. He said he was in Vegas for a few weeks, closing a deal on a commercial building. He asked about her. Where was she from? What brought her to Vegas? What did she want out of life? Diane found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone. About Bakersfield, about feeling stuck, about wanting more, but not knowing what more looked like. Michael listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer advice, he just listened. When he drove her home, he didn't ask to come inside. He just said he would like to see her again. Diane said yes. Over the next month, they saw each other almost every night. Michael took her to nice restaurants, places she had never been. He bought her flowers. He told her she was beautiful, smart, special. He said he had been waiting his whole life to meet someone like her. Diane fell hard. She had never been treated like this before. She had never felt like this before. Michael made her feel like she mattered, like she was more than just a waitress in a casino, like she was someone worth loving. Her friends were skeptical. Karen, her closest friend at the Silver Slipper, asked questions. What does he really do? Why is he always in Vegas? Have you met his family? Diane didn't have good answers, but she didn't care. She was in love. And love, she thought, was enough. In late May, Michael proposed. They were having dinner at a steakhouse on the Strip. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it. Inside was a diamond ring, modest but real. He said he wanted to spend the rest of his life with her. He said they could get married in Vegas, then move to San Diego where he had a house. He said she would never have to work in a casino again. He said he would take care of her. Diane said yes without hesitation. She quit her job at the Silver Slipper 2 weeks later. She gave notice on her apartment. She called her mother and told her the news. Her mother was cautious, asking the same questions Karen had asked. Diane brushed them off. She was happy. She was finally getting out of Vegas. She was starting a new life. She bought a wedding dress, she booked a chapel, she packed her belongings. And on the morning of June 9, 1979, she checked into the Stardust Motel, put on her white dress and waited for her groom to arrive. He never did. At 1:45 p.m., on June 9, 1979, Diane Mitchell stood in front of the mirror in room 107 of the Stardust Motel, adjusting the lace sleeves of her wedding dress. She looked perfect. Her hair was smooth and shining. Her makeup was flawless. The dress fit like it had been made for her. She held her bouquet of white roses and baby's breath, practicing her smile. In 15 minutes, she would walk 3 blocks to the Chapel of Eternal Love. Michael would be waiting. They would say their vows. They would become husband and wife. She felt nervous, but it was the good kind of nervous, the kind that came with anticipation and excitement. This was the beginning of everything. She checked her watch. 1:50. She should leave soon. She didn't want to be late. There was a knock at the door. Diane opened it, expecting to see Michael. Maybe he had come early. Maybe he wanted to see her before the ceremony, even though it was supposed to be bad luck. But it wasn't Michael. It was a man she didn't recognize. Tall, thin, wearing jeans and a denim jacket. He had a forgettable face, the kind you wouldn't remember 5 minutes later. He said Michael had sent him. He said Michael's car had broken down a few miles outside the city, and he needed Diane to come with him. They would pick Michael up, then go to the chapel together. Diane hesitated. Something felt wrong. Why hadn't Michael called? Why hadn't he come himself? The man smiled. He said Michael was embarrassed, that he didn't want to ruin the day, that everything would be fine. He said they needed to hurry. Diane looked at her watch. 1:55. The ceremony was in 5 minutes. If Michael's car had broken down, they would be late, but they could still make it. She grabbed her purse and followed the man outside. The man led her to a car parked in the motel lot, a brown sedan with Nevada plates. He opened the passenger door for her. Diane got in, clutching her bouquet. The man got in the driver's seat and started the engine. He didn't say anything. He just drove. Diane asked where they were going. The man said they were picking up Michael. He said it wasn't far, but they didn't drive toward the edge of the city. They drove deeper into it, turning down side streets, away from the Strip, away from the chapel. Diane's unease grew. She asked again where they were going. The man didn't answer. She reached for the door handle. The man grabbed her wrist. And that's when Diane realized she had made a terrible mistake. What happened next is unclear. The man drove Diane back to the Stardust Motel, back to room 107. Whether she went willingly or was forced, no one knows. Whether she screamed or fought or begged, no one heard. The motel was busy that afternoon, guests checking in and out, cars coming and going. No one noticed a man and a woman entering room 107. No one heard anything unusual. By 2:30 p.m., Diane Mitchell was dead. The man left the motel sometime between 2:30 and 3 p.m. He was seen by a maid in the hallway, but she didn't think anything of it. Guests came and went all the time. He was just another face in a city full of faces. He got into the brown sedan and drove away. He disappeared into the sprawl of Las Vegas, into the desert, into the anonymity that the city offered to anyone who wanted it. And Diane was left alone in room 107, lying on the bed in her wedding dress, her bouquet on the nightstand, her eyes open and unseeing. At 6:30 p.m., the motel manager found her. He called the police. He called an ambulance even though it was clear she was beyond help. He stood in the doorway of room 107, staring at the woman in the white dress, and wondered what the hell had happened. The police arrived. They secured the scene. They photographed the body, the room, the bouquet. They collected evidence, fingerprints, fibers, trace materials. They interviewed the motel staff, the guests in nearby rooms. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. It was as if Diane had simply lain down and died. Detectives searched the room for clues. They found Diane's purse on the dresser, her wallet inside with $40 in cash. They found her suitcases by the door, packed and ready to go. They found her car keys on the nightstand. They found no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle, no weapon, no blood. The only thing missing was the groom. Detectives went to the Chapel of Eternal Love. The officiant confirmed that a wedding had been scheduled for 2 p.m. under the names Diane Mitchell and Michael Cordero. No one had shown up. The chapel had waited 30 minutes, then moved on to the next ceremony. Detectives searched for Michael Cordero. They checked every database they had access to. No real estate investor by that name, no properties, no business licenses, no driver's license, no social security number. They checked the Cadillac Diane had described. No vehicle registered to Michael Cordero in Nevada or California. They checked hotels and motels across Las Vegas. No one by that name had checked in. Michael Cordero didn't exist. He was a ghost. A lie. A man who had never been real. Detectives interviewed Diane's co-workers at the Silver Slipper. They all remembered Michael. He had come into the casino several times in April and May. He had always sat in Diane's section. He had always tipped well. He was polite, charming, well-dressed. But no one knew anything about him. No one had talked to him beyond pleasantries. No one had seen him outside the casino. Karen, Diane's closest friend, said she had met Michael once, briefly, when he picked Diane up after a shift. She described him as handsome, confident, smooth. But she also said something felt off about him, though she couldn't explain what. She said Diane had been so happy, so excited about the wedding. She said Diane had shown her the ring, the dress, the chapel reservation. She said Diane had believed she was starting a new life. And now she was dead. The toxicology report came back 3 weeks later. Diane had been poisoned. The substance was a barbiturate, a sedative that in high doses caused respiratory failure. It had been mixed into something she had ingested, likely a drink. The medical examiner ruled the death a homicide, but there were no suspects, no witnesses, no leads. Michael Cordero, whoever he really was, had vanished. Diane's mother came to Las Vegas to claim her daughter's body. She was 52 years old, but she looked 70. Her face was gray, her eyes hollow. She identified Diane at the morgue, then collapsed in the hallway. She told detectives everything she knew, which wasn't much. Diane had called her in May to say she was getting married. She had described Michael as a real estate investor, kind and generous. She had said they were moving to San Diego. Diane's mother had never met Michael. She had never spoken to him. She had only her daughter's word that he existed, and now her daughter was dead, and the man she was supposed to marry was gone. The case made headlines for a week. Bride found dead on wedding day. Las Vegas mystery. Woman poisoned in motel room. Groom vanishes after fiancé's murder. The story had everything. A beautiful victim, a mysterious killer, a wedding that never happened. The media loved it. The public was horrified and fascinated, but the attention faded quickly. Las Vegas was a city where tragedies happened every day. Suicides, overdoses, murders. Diane Mitchell was just another casualty, another story that would be forgotten as soon as the next one came along. By the end of summer, the case was cold. Detective Frank Delgado was 36 years old in the summer of 1979. He had been with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department for 12 years, most of them spent working homicides. He had seen every kind of death the city could produce: mob hits, domestic violence, bar fights, overdoses. But the Diane Mitchell case was different. It was calculated, it was cruel. And it made no sense. Delgado started with the basics. He built a timeline of Diane's last days. He interviewed everyone who had known her, co-workers, friends, neighbors, family. He searched her apartment, her car, her belongings. He looked for anything that might explain who Michael Cordero really was. He found nothing. Diane had been careful to keep her relationship private. She had told her friends about Michael, but she hadn't introduced him to many people. She had shown them the ring, but she hadn't shared details about his life or his work. It was as if Michael had deliberately kept himself invisible. Delgado focused on the physical evidence. The motel room had been processed thoroughly. Fingerprints had been lifted from the door handle, the dresser, the bathroom sink. Most belonged to Diane. A few belonged to previous guests or motel staff. But there was one set of prints that didn't match anyone in the system. They were found on the nightstand, near where Diane's bouquet had been placed. Delgado logged them as evidence. He ran them through every database available. No match. He also had the brown sedan. A maid at the Stardust had remembered seeing a brown car in the parking lot that afternoon, though she couldn't recall the make or model. Delgado checked rental car companies, used car lots, impound records. He found dozens of brown sedans, but none that led anywhere. Delgado interviewed the motel staff again, the manager, the maids, the front desk clerk. He asked about the man the maid had seen in the hallway. She described him as average height, thin, wearing jeans and a denim jacket. She couldn't remember his face. Delgado asked if anyone had checked into the motel under a suspicious name or paid in cash. The clerk said most guests paid in cash. This was Las Vegas. People didn't use credit cards when they didn't want to be traced. It was another dead end. Delgado turned his attention to the poison. Barbiturates were common in 1979, prescribed for anxiety and insomnia. They were also easy to obtain illegally. Delgado checked pharmacies, doctors, hospitals. He found no prescriptions in Diane's name. He found no evidence that she had been taking medication. The poison had been administered deliberately. Someone had given it to her, likely in a drink, knowing it would kill her. But who and why? Delgado developed a theory. Michael Cordero, whoever he was, had targeted Diane deliberately. He had courted her, proposed to her, convinced her to quit her job and leave her apartment. He had isolated her, made her dependent on him. And then, on the day they were supposed to get married, he had killed her. But why? What was the motive? Delgado considered several possibilities. Maybe Michael was a con artist and Diane had discovered something. Maybe he was married and Diane had become a liability. Maybe he was a serial killer and Diane was just one of many victims. Delgado searched for similar cases. He checked unsolved murders in Nevada, California, Arizona. He looked for women who had been poisoned, women who had been engaged to men who didn't exist, women who had died under mysterious circumstances. He found a few cases that seemed similar, but none that could be definitively linked. By the fall of 1979, Delgado had exhausted every lead. He had interviewed over 100 people. He had followed up on dozens of tips. He had searched every database, every record, every file. He had one set of unidentified fingerprints. He had a vague description of a man in a brown sedan. He had a victim who had been poisoned on her wedding day. But he had no suspect, no motive. No answers. Diane's mother called him every week. She asked if there had been any progress. Delgado always told her the truth. No, ma'am. Not yet. But we're still working on it. He meant it. He didn't want to give up. But he didn't know where else to look. In 1980, Delgado was promoted to sergeant. He was assigned to supervise other detectives, to manage caseloads, to attend meetings. He had less time for individual investigations. The Diane Mitchell case was reassigned to a junior detective, a young man named Tom Vasquez. Delgado briefed him thoroughly, handed over the file, and told him to keep looking. Vasquez tried. He reviewed the evidence, re-interviewed witnesses, followed up on old leads, but he found nothing new. By 1982, the case was officially cold. Over the next 2 decades, the case was occasionally revisited. New detectives would pull the file, review the evidence, look for something that had been missed. But the technology of the time was limited. Fingerprint databases were incomplete. DNA profiling didn't exist. Forensic genealogy was science fiction. The case remained unsolved. In 2005, Frank Delgado retired. He was 62 years old and he had spent 40 years in law enforcement. He had solved hundreds of cases, but the Diane Mitchell case haunted him. He kept a copy of the file in his home office. He would pull it out occasionally late at night and review the evidence. He would stare at the photograph of Diane in her wedding dress, lying on the motel bed, and wonder who had done this to her. He never found the answer. Time moves differently in Las Vegas. The city reinvents itself every decade, tearing down old casinos and building new ones, erasing the past to make room for the future. The Stardust Motel was demolished in 1995, replaced by a parking garage. The Silver Slipper Casino closed in 1988, its neon sign sold to a collector. The places where Diane Mitchell had lived and worked and died disappeared, paved over, forgotten. And with them, the memory of her case faded. Diane's mother, Patricia Mitchell, never stopped searching for answers. She called the Las Vegas Police Department every month for 20 years, asking if there had been any progress. The answer was always the same. "No, ma'am, we're sorry." She kept Diane's room exactly as it had been, the bed made, the closet full of clothes. She kept the wedding dress in a garment bag in the closet, the lace yellowed with age. She kept hoping that someday someone would call and tell her they had found the man who killed her daughter. That call never came. Patricia died in 1999 at the age of 72. She had spent 20 years grieving, 20 years waiting, 20 years living in the shadow of her daughter's unsolved murder. At her funeral, Diane's brother placed a photograph of his sister on the casket. It was the same photo that had been used in the newspapers in 1979, Diane smiling at the camera, her blonde hair shining. The pastor spoke about faith and loss and the hope of reunion, but the words felt empty. Patricia had died without answers. She had died without justice. Diane's case was mentioned in the obituary. Patricia is survived by her children and preceded in death by her daughter Diane, who was murdered in Las Vegas in 1979. The case remains unsolved. It was the final acknowledgement that Diane was gone, that the search was over, that the case was closed. But cases are never truly closed. They wait. In the early 2000s, advances in DNA technology began to change the landscape of cold case investigations. Forensic labs could now extract DNA from evidence that was decades old. Databases like CODIS allowed investigators to compare DNA profiles across jurisdictions. But the Diane Mitchell case had limited biological evidence. The fingerprints on the nightstand had never been matched. The poison had left no trace of the person who administered it. There was no semen, no blood, no hair that could be definitively linked to a suspect. The case remained cold. In 2010, a retired detective named Sarah Chen joined the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's cold case unit. She was 52 years old, methodical, relentless. She had spent 30 years in law enforcement, and she believed that every victim deserved justice, no matter how long it took. One of the first files she pulled was Diane Mitchell's. Chen reviewed the case from beginning to end. She read every report, every interview transcript, every piece of evidence. She was struck by how thorough the original investigation had been. Detective Delgado had done everything right. He had simply run out of leads. But Chen had tools Delgado hadn't had. She had access to national databases, to advanced forensic techniques, to forensic genealogy. She decided to retest the evidence. The fingerprints from the nightstand were sent to a lab for enhancement. Using modern imaging technology, the lab was able to clarify details that had been invisible in 1979. The prints were run through updated databases, still no match. Chen wasn't discouraged. She knew that many criminals had never been fingerprinted, especially if they had committed their crimes decades ago. She turned her attention to other evidence. The motel room had been thoroughly processed in 1979, and some items had been preserved. The bedspread, the drinking glass from the nightstand, the doorknob. Chen requested DNA testing on all of it. The lab extracted DNA from the drinking glass. It was a partial profile degraded by time, But it was there. The DNA belonged to a male, not Diane. Chen uploaded the profile to CODIS, no match. She uploaded it to GEDmatch, a public genealogy database, and she waited. In 2022, the database returned a hit. A distant relative, a man living in Oregon, had uploaded his DNA as part of a family history project. He had no idea he was related to a suspect in a cold case. Chen worked with a forensic genealogist to build a family tree. They traced the man's lineage backward, identifying common ancestors, then forward, mapping out descendants. It took months. But eventually, they narrowed the possibilities to a single family line, and within that line they identified a man who had lived in Las Vegas in 1979. His name was David Alan Marsh. David Alan Marsh was 68 years old in 2023. He lived in a small house in Henderson, Nevada, a suburb 15 miles southeast of Las Vegas. He was retired, a former electrician who had worked for the city for 30 years. He had never been married. He had no children. He lived alone. And in 1979, he had been 24 years old, living in Las Vegas, working odd jobs, drifting. Detective Sarah Chen pulled everything she could find on Marsh. He had a minor criminal record, a DUI in 1982, a petty theft charge in 1985, both misdemeanors. He had been fingerprinted for both arrests. Chen requested his fingerprints from the archives. She compared them to the prints found on the nightstand in Diane Mitchell's motel room. They matched. Chen knew she needed more evidence. A fingerprint from a motel room wasn't enough for a conviction. Marsh could claim he had been a guest at the motel, that he had touched the nightstand innocently, that he had nothing to do with Diane's death. Chen needed a direct DNA match. She began surveilling Marsh. She followed him to the grocery store, to the hardware store, to a diner where he ate breakfast every Saturday morning. She waited for him to discard something that might contain his DNA. On February 10, 2023, Marsh threw away a coffee cup in a public trash can outside a gas station. Chen retrieved it, bagged it, and sent it to the lab. 2 weeks later, the results came back. The DNA on the cup was a direct match to the DNA on the drinking glass from Diane's motel room. David Alan Marsh had been in room 107 on the day Diane Mitchell died. Chen dug deeper into Marsh's background. She discovered that in 1979, he had been living in a cheap apartment near the Strip. He had worked as a handyman, taking cash jobs, moving from place to place. He had no stable employment, no permanent address. He fit the profile of the man the maid had seen in the hallway, average height, thin, forgettable. Chen also discovered something else. In 1981, Marsh had been questioned in connection with another case, the disappearance of a woman in Reno. The woman had been engaged to a man who called himself James Carter. The man had vanished and the woman was never found. The case had gone cold. But the description of James Carter matched the description of Michael Cordero. Chen believed she had found a serial predator. On March 15, 2023, Chen and a team of detectives executed an arrest warrant at Marsh's home. He answered the door in a bathrobe, confused, then terrified. He didn't resist. He didn't ask questions, he just stood there silent as they read him his rights and led him to a patrol car. Neighbors watched from their porches. News cameras arrived within minutes. The headline spread across Nevada, across the country. Las Vegas, 1979, cold case solved. The bride found dead on her wedding day. Marsh was taken to the Clark County Detention Center. He was placed in an interrogation room. Chen sat across from him, a folder open on the table. Inside were photographs, Diane Mitchell in her wedding dress, the motel room, the drinking glass, the DNA report. Chen didn't rush. She had waited 44 years for this moment. She could wait a few more minutes. Finally, Marsh spoke. "I didn't mean for her to die." The confession came slowly, in pieces. Marsh admitted that he had known Diane. He had met her at the Silver Slipper in early 1979. He had been working as a handyman at the casino, fixing slot machines and repairing electrical wiring. He had noticed Diane immediately. She was beautiful, kind, the kind of woman who smiled at everyone. He had tried to talk to her, but she had brushed him off politely. She wasn't interested. Marsh became obsessed. He started following her. He learned her schedule, her routines, where she lived. He watched her from a distance, imagining a life with her. And then, in April, he saw her with Michael Cordero. Marsh's story took a darker turn. He admitted that Michael Cordero was him. He had created the persona deliberately. He had bought a suit, rented a Cadillac, invented a backstory. He had approached Diane at the casino, pretending to be someone he wasn't, and she had believed him. Marsh said he had planned to marry Diane. He said he had genuinely cared about her, but as the wedding approached, he panicked. He realized she would discover the truth. There was no house in San Diego. There was no real estate business. There was no Michael Cordero. He decided to kill her before she could expose him. On the morning of June 9th, Marsh went to a pharmacy and bought barbiturates, claiming they were for his mother's insomnia. He crushed the pills and mixed them into a bottle of champagne. He went to the Stardust Motel. He knocked on the door of room 107. Diane answered, wearing her wedding dress. Marsh told her he was a friend of Michael's, that Michael's car had broken down, that they needed to pick him up. Diane hesitated, but she trusted him. She got into his car. Marsh drove her around the block, then back to the motel. He told her Michael was on his way, that they should wait in the room. He poured her a glass of champagne, a toast to the wedding. Diane drank it. Within 20 minutes, she was unconscious. Within an hour, she was dead. Marsh said he panicked. He left the motel, drove to the edge of the city, and abandoned the car. He walked back to his apartment, burned his clothes, and tried to forget what he had done. But he never forgot. He carried it with him for 44 years. Chen asked him about the woman in Reno. Marsh admitted that he had done the same thing. He had created a fake identity, courted a woman, planned to marry her, then killed her when he realized she would discover the truth. He said there were others. He didn't remember how many, maybe 4, maybe 5. Chen felt sick. She asked where the bodies were. Marsh said he didn't remember. The desert, he thought, somewhere in the desert. David Alan Marsh was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and evidence tampering in the death of Diane Mitchell. He was also charged in connection with the disappearance of the woman in Reno. His trial began in September 2023. The evidence was overwhelming: his confession, the DNA match, the fingerprints, the pattern of behavior. His defense attorney argued that the confession had been coerced, that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that the case was too old to prosecute fairly. The jury didn't buy it. On November 20th, 2023, David Alan Marsh was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He didn't apologize. He didn't look at Diane's family. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and he disappeared into the prison system. Diane Mitchell was finally laid to rest. Her brother, now in his 70s, held a small memorial service in Bakersfield. He placed a photograph of Diane on the altar, the same photo that had been used in the newspapers 44 years earlier. He spoke about his sister. He said she had been kind, hopeful, full of dreams. He said she had deserved better. He said he was grateful that after all these years, she finally had justice. Detective Sarah Chen attended the service. She stood in the back, watching as Diane's family said their final goodbyes. She thought about Patricia Mitchell, who had died without knowing the truth, who had spent 20 years searching for answers. She thought about the silence that had protected David Marsh for 44 years, the silence that had allowed him to live a normal life while Diane's family lived in agony. And she thought about the moment when that silence had finally been broken, when science and persistence and refusal to forget had brought justice, however delayed. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The case became a landmark example of forensic genealogy's power. It was cited in training seminars, in academic papers, in documentaries about cold case investigations. Dozens of other cold cases were solved in the years that followed, using the same techniques that had caught David Marsh. Families received answers. Victims were brought home. Killers were held accountable. Diane Mitchell's case became part of a larger story. A story about how the past is never truly past, how truth has a way of emerging even after decades of darkness. But for Diane's family, for the friends who remembered her, for the city that had forgotten her. The resolution was bittersweet. Diane was gone. She had been gone for 44 years. No amount of justice could bring her back. No conviction could undo the decades of grief and uncertainty, but at least now they knew. At least now she could rest. And at least now the promise that had been broken on her wedding day had finally been kept. The promise of truth. The promise of justice. The promise that she would not be forgotten. David Alan Marsh sat in the interrogation room at the Clark County Detention Center for 2 hours before he spoke. He was 68 years old, but he looked older. His skin was gray, his hands trembled, his eyes were red-rimmed and watery. He wore an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his thin frame. He looked like someone's grandfather. He looked harmless. But Detective Sarah Chen knew better. She sat across from him, a folder open on the table between them. Inside were photographs, Diane Mitchell in her wedding dress, the motel room, the drinking glass, the DNA report that had led them to this moment. Chen didn't rush. She had waited 44 years for this conversation. She could wait a few more minutes. Finally, Marsh spoke. "I knew this day would come." His voice was soft, barely above a whisper. Chen leaned forward. "Tell me what happened, David." The story came out slowly in fragments like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered for decades. Marsh admitted that he had created the Michael Cordero persona. He had bought a suit at a thrift store, rented a Cadillac for a week, invented a backstory about being a real estate investor. He had studied how successful men talked, how they carried themselves, how they made women feel special. He had approached Diane at the Silver Slipper deliberately. He had watched her for weeks before that, learning her schedule, her routines, her vulnerabilities. He knew she was lonely. He knew she wanted more from life. He knew exactly what to say. And she had believed him. Marsh said he had genuinely intended to marry Diane, at least at first. He said he had cared about her in his own way. But as the wedding date approached, reality set in. There was no house in San Diego. There was no real estate business. There was no future. Diane would discover the truth. She would leave him. She would expose him. She would humiliate him. He couldn't let that happen. On the morning of June 9, 1979, Marsh went to a pharmacy on the east side of Las Vegas. He told the pharmacist his mother was having trouble sleeping, that her doctor had recommended barbiturates. The pharmacist sold him a bottle of Seconal without asking questions. This was 1979. Regulations were loose. No one checked. Marsh went back to his apartment and crushed 20 pills into a fine powder. He mixed the powder into a small bottle of champagne he had bought the day before. He shook it until the powder dissolved completely. Then he drove to the Stardust Motel. He knocked on the door of room 107 at 1:50 p.m. Diane answered, wearing her wedding dress. She looked beautiful. She looked happy. She looked at him with confusion. Marsh told her he was a friend of Michael's, that Michael had sent him, that there had been a problem with the car. He said Michael was waiting a few blocks away, that they needed to pick him up quickly or they would miss the ceremony. Diane hesitated. She didn't recognize him, but he knew Michael's name. He knew about the wedding. He seemed legitimate. She grabbed her purse and followed him outside. Marsh led her to his brown sedan, a 1976 Ford Granada he had bought used for $300. He opened the passenger door for her. Diane got in, clutching her bouquet. Marsh drove around the block, then back to the motel. He told Diane that Michael had called, that he was running even later, that they should wait in the room. He said he had brought champagne to celebrate, that they could have a toast while they waited. Diane was nervous. She kept checking her watch, but she trusted him. He was Michael's friend. Michael had sent him. Marsh opened the champagne in the motel room. He poured 2 glasses. He handed one to Diane. "To your wedding day," he said. Diane smiled and drank. Within 15 minutes, Diane began to feel dizzy. She sat on the edge of the bed, confused. She asked Marsh what was happening. He didn't answer. He just watched. Within 30 minutes, she was unconscious. She fell back onto the bed, her wedding dress spreading around her like a white cloud. Her bouquet slipped from her hand and landed on the nightstand. Marsh stood there for a long time, watching her breathe. Each breath came slower than the last. shallow, labored, fading. By 2:30 p.m., Diane Mitchell was dead. Marsh panicked. He hadn't thought beyond this moment. He hadn't planned what to do with the body, how to cover his tracks, how to disappear. He wiped down the champagne bottle and the glass he had used. He left Diane's glass on the nightstand, her fingerprints still on it. He wiped the door handle, the dresser, anything he thought he had touched. But he missed the nightstand. He had placed his hand there when he leaned over to check Diane's pulse. His fingerprints remained invisible, waiting. Marsh left the motel at 2:45 p.m. A maid saw him in the hallway, but she didn't think anything of it. He was just another guest, just another face. He got into his brown sedan and drove east, toward Boulder City, toward the desert. He pulled over on a remote stretch of highway and threw the champagne bottle into a ravine. He burned the suit he had worn as Michael Cordero in a trash barrel behind a gas station. Then he drove back to Las Vegas, back to his apartment, back to his life. And he tried to forget what he had done. But he never forgot. For 44 years he carried the weight of Diane's death. He saw her face in his dreams. He heard her voice asking what was happening. He remembered the way her hand had gone limp, the way her breathing had stopped. He moved from apartment to apartment, job to job, always looking over his shoulder, always waiting for the knock on the door. And on March 15, 2023, the knock finally came. Chen listened to Marsh's confession without interrupting. When he finished, she asked the question that had haunted the case for decades. Why Diane? Why her? Marsh was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Because she believed me. Because she trusted me. Because she made me feel like I was someone I wasn't." Chen felt a cold rage settle in her chest. Diane had died because she had been kind, because she had given a lonely man the benefit of the doubt, because she had dared to hope for something better. "Did you do this to other women?" Chen asked. Marsh nodded slowly. "3 others, maybe 4. I don't remember all of them." Chen asked for details. Marsh provided what he could remember. A woman in Reno in 1981, engaged to a man who called himself James Carter. A woman in Phoenix in 1984, engaged to a man who called himself Robert Sullivan. A woman in Albuquerque in 1987, engaged to a man who called himself Thomas Blake. All of them had disappeared. All of them had been found dead or never found at all. All of them had been poisoned. Chen felt sick. David Marsh wasn't just a killer. He was a serial predator who had spent decades targeting vulnerable women, promising them love and a future, then taking their lives when the illusion became too difficult to maintain. Marsh was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Diane Mitchell. He was also charged in connection with the deaths of the 3 other women he had confessed to killing. Prosecutors in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico coordinated their cases. The evidence was overwhelming. Marsh's confession, the DNA match, the fingerprints, the pattern of behavior spanning decades. His trial began on September 18, 2023, in Clark County District Court. The courtroom was packed. Diane's brother, now 76 years old, sat in the front row. He had flown in from Bakersfield, determined to see justice for his sister. The prosecution presented their case methodically. They showed the jury photographs of Diane in her wedding dress, lying dead on the motel bed. They played recordings of Marsh's confession. They presented the DNA evidence, the fingerprint analysis, the testimony of forensic experts. They called witnesses who had known Diane, who described her as kind, hopeful, trusting. They painted a picture of a young woman whose only crime had been believing in love. The defense argued that the confession had been coerced, that Marsh had been confused and frightened, that he had said what the detectives wanted to hear. They argued that the DNA evidence was circumstantial, that Marsh could have been in the motel room for innocent reasons. The jury didn't believe it. On November 3, 2023, after 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, kidnapping, evidence tampering. Marsh showed no emotion when the verdict was read. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table in front of him, his eyes fixed on nothing. Diane's brother wept quietly in the front row. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. The judge asked if Marsh had anything to say. Marsh stood slowly. He looked at Diane's brother for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "I'm sorry for what I did. I'm sorry for the pain I caused." Diane's brother stood up. His voice shook with rage. "You're not sorry. You're sorry you got caught. My sister trusted you. She believed in you. And you killed her on what should have been the happiest day of her life. You don't deserve forgiveness. You don't deserve mercy." The judge agreed. David Allen Marsh was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 68 years old. He would die in prison. He was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs and leg irons. He shuffled slowly, his head down, his shoulders hunched. He looked small. He looked defeated. He disappeared into the Nevada prison system, and the world moved on. Diane Mitchell's remains, which had been held in the coroner's office for 44 years, were finally released to her family. Her brother arranged for her to be buried in Bakersfield, in the same cemetery where their parents were buried. The funeral was small, just family and a few old friends who still remembered Diane. Detective Sarah Chen attended, standing quietly in the back. The headstone read, "Diane Marie Mitchell, November 12, 1954, June 9, 1979. Beloved daughter, sister, friend." The wait is over. After the service, Diane's brother approached Chen. He shook her hand, his grip firm despite his age. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for bringing my sister home." Chen nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. She had spent 3 years working this case, 3 years chasing a ghost, 3 years refusing to let Diane be forgotten. And now it was over. The case became a landmark in forensic genealogy. It was featured in documentaries, in true crime podcasts, in training seminars for cold case detectives. It demonstrated the power of modern DNA technology to solve crimes that had seemed unsolvable. In the years that followed, dozens of other cold cases were reopened using the same techniques. Families received answers, victims were identified, killers were brought to justice. Diane Mitchell's case became part of a larger story, a story about persistence and science and the refusal to let time erase the truth. But for Diane's family, the resolution was bittersweet. Diane was gone. She had been gone for 44 years. No conviction could bring her back. No sentence could undo the decades of grief and unanswered questions. But at least now they knew. At least now she could rest. And at least now the promise that had been broken on her wedding day had finally been kept. Not the promise of marriage, not the promise of a future with Michael Cordero, the man who never existed, but the promise of justice. The promise that her death would not be forgotten. The promise that the truth would emerge no matter how long it took. Las Vegas continued to reinvent itself. The old casinos were torn down and replaced with new ones. The Strip grew taller, brighter, louder. The city that Diane had known in 1979 disappeared, paved over, erased. But her story remained. It was told in courtrooms and classrooms, in articles and documentaries, in conversations between people who believed that every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed. Diane Mitchell was no longer just a name in a cold case file. She was no longer just a bride who never made it to the altar. She was a reminder that promises can be broken, but they can also be kept. A reminder that silence can last for decades, but it can also be shattered. A reminder that the past is never truly past, and the truth has a way of emerging, even from the deepest darkness. In 2024, Detective Sarah Chen retired from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. She was 63 years old. She had spent 40 years in law enforcement, and she had solved hundreds of cases. But the Diane Mitchell case was the one she would remember most. She kept a photograph of Diane on her desk, the same photograph that had been used in the newspapers in 1979. Diane smiling at the camera, her blonde hair shining, her eyes full of hope. Chen looked at that photograph often, and she thought about the young woman who had put on a white dress and driven to a wedding chapel, believing that her life was about to begin. Diane's life had ended that day, but her story hadn't. Her story had waited 44 years to be told. And now finally it had been heard. Some promises are made to be broken, but some promises are made to be kept, and justice, however delayed, is one of them.